Hello, food science. I hope that you have had kind of a good time learning about leavening agents. We have spent a lot of time talking about mechanical leavening agents and chemical leavening agents. Just as a reminder for you, our mechanical leavening agents are water turning into steam as well as air, and our chemical leavening agents are baking soda and baking powder. And hopefully, through what we've learned over the last few weeks, you've kind of understood the difference between baking soda and baking powder. Now, the last thing we need to do is we need to talk about biological leavening agents, and this one is probably the one that you have seen pretty frequently, and it's yeast. So we're going to be talking about yeast a little bit. There has interestingly been kind of a run on yeast at the grocery store lately. People have been buying a lot of yeast because I think they thought that we weren't going to have bread, or they have time at home to work on baking things. So a lot of people have been kind of stocking up on yeast and working on a lot of baking projects. And so it's kind of neat to see this happening as we go along. All right. So right here, this picture is what a yeast looks like. Now it's kind of confusing. Yeast is the plural and yeast is the singular. So this here is a yeast, but all of these are also yeast as well. So if you think about yeast, when you get them from the grocery store, sometimes they kind of have like a little like tubular shape to them. I will quick Google that for you since I don't have a picture on here. This is a perfect image here. So if you look at these yeast here, when you look at them, they are kind of these little tubes. And what happens is they are actually hundreds of yeast actually put together into these kind of little pellets. And then it's actually kind of interesting. On the outside of the pellets themselves, most of the outside yeast are dead, and on the inside, the yeast are alive. So if we go back to my presentation, so if you think about one of those little tubes of yeast that you see, the outside ones are dead, but inside you have these live little kind of fungus life forms that are there and are doing some work to help us, make some yummy bread and stuff like that. So what yeast actually are is they are kind of a round egg-shaped unicellular fungus that is a living organism. So they are totally alive. And your body is also covered in a certain type of yeast as well. So yeast are kind of prevalent all around you, and you have them, kind of everywhere. You can technically catch and grow your own personal live yeast if you even just kind of open up like the window and have the right like food sources for them. You can actually start to catch and grow your own yeast as well. But they are alive. So on your body, on all of it, they are alive and well. Individually, one yeast is smaller than the head of a pin, so they are incredibly teeny tiny. So like I said, when you see those granules of yeast that you use for cooking, those contain hundreds, if not thousands, of individual yeast in that little pellet. And if you think about when you're using it, you scoop in quite a bit of yeast, and there are a lot involved in a recipe when you start to use them. Okay. The most well-known type of yeast that you see most of the time is something called Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So that is called either a brewer's yeast or a baking yeast. And it is the yeast that they use for when you make bread, but more importantly, a lot of times, especially in Wisconsin, it is used in wine making and in beer making. So to get all of the fruit or barley to ferment the way that they want it to, they have to add yeast to kind of help the process with that. And if you want specific types of wine or beer to show up, you use different varieties of this Saccharomyces cerevisiae there, and it'll give you the different flavors that you see. Again, you are not 21, so this is no concern for you for a couple of years yet. But if you are into home brewing or wine making, all of those things are caused by different strains of yeast. If you see the word saccaro there, saccaro means sugar, which means that they like to eat sugar. And so when you have a yeast in a recipe or yeast in a brewing recipe, they are feeding kind of off of the sugars in a bunch of different things. And later on, we're going to be doing a lab where I'm going to be taking some yeast under different conditions, and we'll see what conditions they like the best for doing their job. All right, although they were discovered before In 1857, Louis Pasteur, the guy who pasteurized things, when we talked about, killing different or treating different things to make sure that they are safe to eat, Louis Pasteur analyzed yeast and understood the fermentation process that they cause. So Louis Pasteur is actually credited with kind of understanding how yeast work, and then after he knows how they work, they can learn to take advantage of them. So what yeast do is that they function in two different ways depending on how much air they have supplied to them, specifically oxygen. So if you have yeast that have an abundant amount of air, they are going to multiply rapidly. They will naturally grow on their own and, turn into more yeast. Just like bacteria, they kind of split, and so they'll split and turn one yeast turns into two, turns into four, etc., etc. If you cut off the air supply for the yeast, though, even a little bit, they start to go through a fermentation process, and the fermentation process is what we try to take advantage of when we bake or we brew things. Okay, so what we have here is, oops, sorry about that. What we have here is the yeast multiplication. So this little equation here, if you think about it, this is a yeast, this is sugar or food it's going to eat, and this is air. And what ends up happening is when you give yeast the appropriate food and oxygen to grow, what happens is they feed off of that sugar, and then the air converts to carbon dioxide and water. So you do get some of the CO2 and H2O that develops, but then it also produces heat, and that's what's happening here. This little yeast guy here, he's getting warm. And what happens is when it's warm and under the right conditions, the yeast actually split and multiply through a process called budding. So you can kind of see here, one yeast turns into two, and this is not the greatest picture, so these two should turn into four, and they turn into and keep growing and multiplying. Eventually, when the yeast kind of runs out of steam, that particular one dies, but it's produced so many offspring that it continues to grow. And so if you are trying to keep yeast alive, you are going to be doing this process. You're going to be giving them food, you're going to be giving them air, you're going to be giving them kind of a cozy temperature to work at, their favorite temperature, and then they're going to be growing and multiplying. When you buy yeast, sometimes I've seen it at festival especially, you can buy, it's called cake yeast, and that is like alive and kicking, really fresh yeast that you get. The yeast that you have is dried out, like I said, on the outside, so it kills the yeast that are on the outside, but the inside ones are kind of put into like a stasis, and then they wake up when they get water back on them. This is kind of what that yeast multiplication looks like. So if you just provide an ample amount of air and food and water, you get kind of this foaming action, which is the leavening part that we want to take advantage of. But then it produces more yeast, and it'll keep producing that if you let it until it runs out of food. Interestingly, there has been a big push for sourdough starters, and sourdough starters are just basically a specific type of yeast that are designed to produce a tangy flavor in breads. And sourdough starters are things that are actually passed on from family to family when we talk about this. Like there's people who's like, oh, my house is burning down. I gotta quick grab my sourdough starter from the fridge. Let me grab it. And then they leave their house. So some of these things are like traditions. I heard a podcast the other week talking about it where there's like literally like a library of sourdough starters. People have hobbies that are kind of strange. And the man said that he found a sourdough starter that was from Alaska back when the gold rush was happening. So the sourdough starter was, over 100 years old, and they had kept feeding it and keeping it alive, and it's the same yeast. And it's just kind of a really interesting thing if you're into that kind of thing, to work with it. The other process that yeast go through is something called fermentation. So fermentation, what happens is you cut the air supply off of it. This is especially what happens in brewing and winemaking. And so what happens is without the air present, the yeast consume the sugar molecules, which is totally normal. But instead of producing CO2 and water, they produce carbon dioxide again, but then they produce these specific flavor molecules depending on the type of yeast. So if you want to produce a certain type of beer or wine, you use a certain type of yeast that's going to give you these specific flavors that you want. And then they also produce a little bit of heat there. And so that is what you're looking for. Now, when you bake bread, the bread goes through kind of two parts. It goes through a little bit of the yeast growing, but a lot of it, if you think about this, the yeast on the outside of this loaf of bread here, they get oxygen. So in theory, if you give them enough time, they're going to grow and multiply. Most of the yeast, though, are kind of trapped on the inside of the bread, and they are doing their job fermenting. And so what happens is if you give them enough time, they are going to produce the carbon dioxide bubbles that you want, and then they also produce flavoring. And that flavoring is what gives bread its specific flavors. So if you have a sourdough starter that's unique and it's producing its unique flavors, that's all coming from the fermentation process. And additionally, it gets hot too. So if you touch bread dough that's been kind of working with yeast, it is warm to the touch, and you'll be able to kind of feel that a little bit. Okay. They do produce in this process here a lot of time some alcohol. And if you're trying to brew, that's obviously what you're looking for. But if we're trying to make yeast in bread, you do not want to do that. And it's actually kind of convenient. Alcohol has a lower boiling point than water does. And alcohols usually burn off in like the 60 to 70 degrees Celsius range, and water's boiling point is 100 degrees Celsius. So what happens is if I take this loaf of bread or this dough here and I put it into the oven, what'll happen is the alcohol will actually burn off of the bread or burn out of the dough, and then it leaves the flavor there, but it doesn't actually leave any alcohol. So you can't, like get drunk off of your bread that you're eating or something like that. But the flavors that it leaves are what gives the bread its unique flavor and its taste. And so because of that, you don't have to worry about yeast. So I think, oh, here's something kind of interesting. So there was a man who worked at a brewery, and he actually was one of the brewmasters at work there, and he had a beard. And when you work in a food place, you have to have a beard net on. But yeast are pretty small, and they travel in your hands and skin and all that kind of stuff. And so he actually had the yeast taken from his beard. They took a sample of yeast, grew it, and then turned it into a beer that was flavored from his beard yeast. And it was a unique flavor that had just grown in his beard. It's kind of nasty, but kind of cool. Yeast are very much affected by their area. So depending on where the yeast are growing, especially wild yeast, if you capture them for a sourdough starter, are going to be really different in one place versus another. And so that gives every kind of bread a little bit of a unique flavor to it, because it's got different things in the environment that it's going for. San Francisco is really known for its sourdough, but if you guys have a sourdough starter here in Manitowoc versus a sourdough starter in San Francisco, you're going to have very different tasting bread because of the different climate that they live in. So thanks for listening. We will continue to talk about yeast and hopefully get the notes down. If you have any questions, be sure to email me.